Hello, everybody. This is Jennifer Matarese, and before I get started with the episode today, I'd just like to take care of the usual housekeeping. For starters, paid requests are open. If you're interested in submitting a disaster request, please double check the list of requests I most recently posted on the podcast Facebook and Tumblr accounts to make sure your request has not already been made. Also, please look through past episodes to verify I haven't already covered the disaster in question. To submit a request, you can send a donation of $30 or more to the podcast PayPal at disasterareatmail.com, on Venmo at Disaster Area Podcast, or on Cash App at Disaster Area Pod. Just add the name of the disaster to the notes on your donation. If you have an idea for an episode subject but you're not sure if it qualifies, feel free to message me and I can approve one way or the other. The subject from this particular episode was chosen by me for reasons I'll get into. If you'd still like to help support the podcast in another way, you can do so with a one-time donation through PayPal, Venmo, or Cash App, or on a per-episode basis through Patreon at www.patreon.com/disasterareapodcast. A per-episode donation of even as little as $1 an episode can help me do things like pay the rent and keep the lights on. And if you do join the Patreon, you will get new episodes ad-free as soon as I record them, rather than waiting until they are released on the main feed. So if you do become a patron, I would very much appreciate it. You can also follow the podcast on Facebook at Disaster Area Podcast, on Instagram at Disaster Area Pod, and on Tumblr at Disaster Area-podcast. Also, please think about rating and reviewing the podcast on whichever podcasting app you might be listening on. And as always, the sources for each new episode can be found at disasterareapodcast.wordpress.com and in the episode description wherever you might be listening. The sources for this episode include the air crash investigation episode Blind Spot, an article by Thomas Schess published in San Diego Magazine titled This Is It, a press release from the San Diego Air and Space Museum titled Memorializing the 45th Anniversary of the Crash of PSA Flight 182 at the San Diego Air and Space Museum, an article on SanDiegoHistory.org by Alexander D. Bevel titled Memories That Will Never Go Away, the crash of Flight 182 and its aftermath, Allec Joshua Ibay's flight simulator recreation of the collision titled Blind Spot, and the NTSB report on the crash. With all of that taken care of, thank you very much for listening, and welcome to Disaster Area. Episode 268, Pacific Southwest Flight 182, September 25th, 1978. 144 deceased, 9 injured. On July 8th, 2026, Mary Wallace Funk, better known as Wally Funk, passed away at the age of 87. There is no better word for it. Wally Funk was a badass. She had her first flying lesson when she was only 9 years old, and she got her pilot's license by the time she was 19. She became the first female flight instructor at a U.S. military base at the age of 21 at Fort Sill in Oklahoma, and was the first female inspector for the Federal Aviation Administration. She was one of the Mercury 13, a group of 13 women who passed the privately funded Women in Space program in the early 60s, again when she was only 21. 12 out of the 13 would never get to become an astronaut thanks to NASA's restrictions, but Wally Funk did, going up in space with Blue Origin in 2021. She also became the oldest person to go into space at the time and is still the oldest woman to ever go into space. But in the middle of all of that, Wally Funk also did something that is more related to the subject of this podcast. In 1974, she became the first female air crash investigator for the National Transportation Safety Board. As a result, she looked into the reasons behind around 450 crashes. One of those was a deadly collision I have been meaning to cover on this podcast for a while. So in honor of the memory of a truly amazing woman and aviator, I give you Pacific Southwest Flight 182. Now, September 25th, 1978 would be, at least in meteorological terms, creeping towards insufferable. Early in the morning, on that Monday morning, the temperature cracked 80 degrees Fahrenheit and would continue to rise until it topped 100 degrees. San Diego was smoggy that day, giving the area a bit of a haze. It wasn't too smoggy. It wasn't like terrifyingly smoggy like you see in some pictures of Los Angeles in the 70s, but it was a little bit hazy out there. Still, it promised to be a typical Southern California day straight out of the movies, with the sun passing through a cloudless blue sky. As the day began, Pacific Southwest Flight 182 approached the city from the north. Flight 182 was a Boeing 727 constructed 10 years earlier. It was 153 feet long and painted in the company's signature colors of fuchsia, orange, red, and white. It kind of looked like, one of the sources described it as like fruit striped gum. It was like that. Pacific Southwest flights were short, sweet, and taken on planes which had their signature smiling design painted on the front of the plane. The nose had a black spot on the tip, and then there was a black curve on the front like a smiley face. So it looked like the plane was happy to be of service to you. And after 29 years in service, Pacific Southwest, the company itself, had yet to have a serious accident involving one of its aircraft. It did come close once in the 60s. There was a point where one of their planes was attempting to land and it kind of nicked a Cessna that was in midair. But fortunately, both planes were able to go on their way. The Cessna was landing. The passenger jet was continuing onward, and they just kept going because the damage wasn't that bad. So they have had smooth sailing pretty much from the beginning. After departing Sacramento earlier in the morning and stopping over in Los Angeles, Pacific Southwest Flight 182 would be flying into Lindbergh Field in San Diego, and that trip from Los Angeles would be a 30-minute trip, give or take. Lindbergh Field was located about 3 miles away from downtown San Diego, sitting amongst an otherwise quiet residential area. Obviously, it's not quiet all the time. There are planes constantly flying over it and around it. It's a busy airspace. There's an airport right there. I'm sure it's not a lot of fun if you don't like noise to live under the pathway of a major airport like that, but it looks to be, in pictures from back then and from now, just a nice little neighborhood. You know, a lot of little houses. Now you can see that there's a lot of single-story residential homes in the area, maybe little cafes and things like that, like little businesses, little shops. Like, it's not a very fast-paced area, or at least it seems that way. Lindbergh Field only had one runway and was the busiest such airport in the country. It had one working runway. When you look at the NTSB report, it said that it had 2 runways, but as I understood it, it had like one main runway that was runway 9 in one direction and runway 27 in the other. So it's a pretty crowded airport, pretty busy airport as it is, but San Diego is also a very busy place to fly into and out of. So it's just a lot of planes in the air over this area. And because the runway ran east to west in direction, Flight 182 would need to make a left north of the airport, so they're going to fly east, and then make a sharp U-turn to land on runway 27. So you have to kind of imagine it a little bit like the top of a coat hanger. That's the word I'm looking for. A coat hanger. A metal coat hanger, kind of bent a little bit so it's a little narrower, not round, but like flat on top. And then, so that's the kind of direction that they're going in. They're coming down from the north. They're veering to the left, and then they're kind of curving around to land on runway 27. That day, Flight 182 had 7 crew members. There were 3 in the cockpit and 4 flight attendants. There was another person as well in the cockpit, but we'll get to that. The captain on this flight was 42-year-old James McFerrin. He'd been employed by PSA since 1961, qualified on 727s in 1967, and had flown 14,382 hours, 10,482 hours of which were on the 727. His co-pilot that morning was 38-year-old First Officer Robert Fox, who was in control of the plane for the landing into San Diego. Fox had been with PSA for 9 years. He qualified for First Officer in 1970 and had flown for 10,049 hours, 5,800 of which were in 727s. Both he and Captain McFerrin had only had a little over 7 hours between ending their flight duty the previous day and arriving for Flight 182 that morning. So I don't mean like 7 hours off, not including like getting out of the building, going home, taking a shower, going to bed, waking up, like all of that. No, they just had 7 hours. So they went to wherever it was that they were sleeping. They had to, take a shower, eat something, go to bed, maybe had 5 hours, if that, 4 or 5 hours of sleep, and then turned right back around and came back to fly this particular flight. Also in the cockpit was 44-year-old flight engineer Martin Wayne and Captain Spencer Nelson, who was off duty at the time, and basically just flying in the jump seats. Wayne had been with PSA since 1967, with 10,800 flight hours, of which 6,587 were completed on 727s. He, too, had only had 7 hours off between this flight and the last. So when we're looking at this crew, they are a very experienced crew. This is not a bunch of people, a group of people who are inexperienced or are, failing their tests and certifications and training. No, all of these people who were working in the cockpit that day on Flight 182 had very good records. Also among those flying on Flight 182 were 29 employees of Pacific Southwest. The Pacific Southwest headquarters were located at Lindbergh Field, and the employees were headed there for work, for training meetings, those sort of things. There was a little bit of pride in San Diego that Pacific Southwest was headquartered there. People knew that, Pacific Southwest, that's our airline. So, people would say later after things had happened and when they were realizing what was happening and what had happened, that's one of ours. That's one of our planes. Elsewhere, 2 men were folded into the cramped interior of a single-engine Cessna 172 Skylark. The Cessna, which sported the number N7711G, was owned and operated by Gibbs Flight Center, a company based at the smaller Montgomery Field, not far from Lindbergh Field. 35-year-old Marine Corps Sergeant David Lee Boswell was taking flight lessons with 32-year-old Martin Casey Jr., specifically practicing ILS, or Instrument Landing System, approaches so he could get his instrument rating. That put Boswell in the seat on the left and Casey in the one on the right. So if you're looking from the back seat, you have Boswell on your left and Casey on your right. However, because Lindbergh Field was the only airport in the county qualified for ILS certification training, Boswell would need to practice touch and go landings amongst the close arrivals and departures of the other flights. So he goes and he does 2 touchdowns at runway 9 and kind of touch and goes. Just kind of comes down, does that, and goes back up again, and then does it again. As part of his instruction that day, Boswell sported a training hood, which obstructed his vision a lot like blinders on a horse. If you Google pilot training hood, you'll find that they're basically a sun visor with sidewalls, or like a really big visor. It could be cardboard, it can be plastic, but the ones that you find when you Google it and you look up pictures of these training hoods have kind of walls on the sides, so you can't look out the windows, you can only look down and ahead at your instruments. They narrow your field of vision, like I said, directly to what's in front of you, so the comparison to blinders for horses is pretty accurate. You're not completely obstructed from seeing things around you, but this keeps your mind and your eyes focused on what they're supposed to be focused on. That way you are focusing, and Boswell was in this particular instance, on the instruments, and he wasn't slipping into visual flight habits. He'd already practiced 2 landings using only the instruments on runway 9 at Lindbergh Field. Now they were going to head back to Montgomery Field, which meant going to the northeast, with an order from Lindbergh Tower Control to stay below 3,500 feet and fly at a heading of 70 degrees. Now, I really want to explain something before I proceed. There are 2 different air traffic control centers that are involved in this story. There is Miramar and there is Lindbergh. Lindbergh Tower is the approach controller that gets you when you get below a certain height, a certain altitude. And it's just for Lindbergh Field. And then you have Miramar, which would cover planes and airports throughout the area, throughout San Diego. So there are two different things going on here. And so if it might sound a little confusing in regards to tower control commands and who they're coming from, but I will try to be as clear as possible. Bear with me. Flight 182 was readying to turn and line itself up for the field at the runway at Lindbergh Field as the clock ticked toward 9 a.m. Air traffic control warned PSA 182 of traffic ahead. Now, that was Miramar. Like I said, there's two controllers at play. You have Lindbergh Field and you have Miramar at the San Diego Approach Center, which is miles away from this. So Lindbergh Field would be like the landing controller, and the tower controller, that's the tower. That's all wrapped up in that. And then you have Miramar, who is this other person who is commanding different flights. So when they get this kind of warning that there is traffic ahead, Fox says to Fox, who is the first officer, says to the others in the cockpit, got it. He's communicating with McFerrin because he's in control of the landing. And he said that when he thought he saw the Cessna. Now he has to look straight ahead and kind of look out and see this little plane. And he spotted it. And McFerrin informed the controller over the radio, traffic in sight. That would have been Miramar. The controller at Miramar then advised the crew to maintain visual separation. You can see the Cessna, you avoid the Cessna. And because it was the bigger plane, it was the one that had to keep the eye out. It was the one who kind of took responsibility. That flight crew in the cockpit of Flight 182, they took the responsibility of keeping track of where that Cessna was and avoiding it accordingly, or asking for more help if they lost track of it. Captain McFerrin got in touch with the tower at Lindbergh Field and said, Lindbergh, PSA 182, downwind. The tower confirmed it received its transmission. Then it warned Flight 182, traffic 12 o'clock, 1 mile, a Cessna. The Cessna in question was the one in which Boswell and Cassie were flying, but the airspace over San Diego wasn't empty, so Flight 182 would need to keep a sharp eye out for the plane ahead of them and keep locked on that. Like I said, there were many planes in the skies over San Diego that day. There was another Cessna that was ahead of them, but it was a different type of Cessna. It wasn't the same kind. It was a slightly bigger, I believe. So the differences between the two, especially as noted in the NTSB report, were enough that if they lost track of one and thought they saw another one, they should have been able to look at that and realize, hey, that's not the Cessna that we're supposed to be watching for. That's a different Cessna. In the cockpit, First Officer Fox said, flaps 5. Is that the one we're looking at? McFerrin asked about the Cessna. And then he said, oh, okay, we got it there a minute ago, he told the controller. And the controller confirmed he heard him. And Captain McFerrin added, I think he's passed on to our right. Now, this is the controller in the tower at Lindbergh. Pro tip. Remember the verb tense McFerrin used there to describe the Cessna he spotted. Passed. P-A-S-S-E-D. Okay, that's going to come back later. At 9 a.m. and 52 seconds, Captain McFerrin could be heard saying, he was right over there a minute ago, indicating he lost track of the other plane. 20 seconds later, he asked, are we clear of that Cessna? Flight engineer Wayne said, supposed to be. McFerrin said, I guess. Captain Nelson, the off-duty officer in the jump seat, piped up with, I hope. And then they kind of had a little chuckle over that. It was kind of amusing in the moment because, of course, they weren't thinking anything bad. The tower told McFerrin, PSA 182 cleared to land. McFerrin then said, PS 182 is cleared to land, repeating that for the cockpit. At that point, First Officer Fox said gear down as the landing gear was lowered, including the nose gear. He could see another aircraft in the distance and said, "There's one underneath. I was looking at that inbound over there." That was the last normal moment in the flight. 2,600 feet above the mid-city neighborhood of San Diego at 9:01 a.m. and 48 seconds, Pacific Southwest Flight 182 collided with the Cessna containing Boswell and Kazi from overhead. The underside of the 727 struck the roof of the Cessna right above the intersection of 38th Street and El Cajon Boulevard. The smaller plane tumbled backwards, hitting the wing, where its ruptured gas tank ignited flames on the wing of Flight 182. Inside the cockpit of the 727, Captain McFerrin said, "Easy, baby, easy. What have we got here?" First Officer Fox replied, "It's bad." McFerrin asked, "Huh?" Fox said, "We're hit, man, we're hit." Captain McFerrin then said over the radio to air traffic control at Lindbergh Field, "Tower, we're going down. This is PSA." The controller replied in a calm voice, "Okay, we'll call the equipment for you." At this point, voices start to blur and become harder to identify. One of the men in the cockpit said, "woo," or swore. Somebody who was clearly not First Officer Bob Fox said his first name. They said Bob. Captain McFerrin said, "This is it, baby. Brace yourselves." An unidentified person in the cockpit then said, "Hey, baby." Then one of the four men said one of the most heartbreaking things you'd want to hear on a cockpit voice recorder. "Ma, I love you." It was right after this that Flight 182 hit the ground, a good 3 miles away from reaching Lindbergh Field at 9:02 a.m. and 7 seconds. It had continued onward from the collision site around 3,500 feet. At the precise moment when the two planes were meeting their tragic fate, a press conference for the president of the County Board of Supervisors was being held at a Go-Low gas station at University Avenue and Boundary Street. Board President, Supervisor Lucille Moore spoke before a group of reporters, photographers, and cameramen at the service station on the western side of Interstate 805, which kind of runs right in the middle of all of this stuff. This is about 10 blocks to the west of the intersection over which the two planes collided. Two of the news people on site were Channel 39 reporter John Britton and cameraman Steve Howell. Also, there was Hans Wendt, a staff photographer with the San Diego County Public Relations Office. Wendt moved back so he would be able to get a better shot of the crowd. This put him out from under the overhang of the gas station and in a perfect spot to get a clear shot of Flight 182 falling from the sky. When the news people in the group heard the explosion of the collision from above, they all turned in that direction. There were a lot of witnesses to what happened. This is a Monday morning. It is 9 a.m. There are a lot of people out and about. There are people who are just getting to work. There are people who are driving to work. There are people who are off work. So there are just a lot of people out and seeing this occur over their heads. Steve Howell, who'd been recording Supervisor Moore as she spoke, turned with his camera and caught the image of the Cessna falling to the ground. In the video, a burning piece of debris from either the Cessna or the 727 descends towards the ground. The body of the Cessna, or what looks like the body of the Cessna, or at least the tail, follows just behind it, twirling like a top. Off camera, a man's voice, either Britton or Howell, says to the other, "Do you see it over there? Come on, get in the car. I see it. Come on, take this." Howell bolted down the street with his camera still rolling. Britton jumped into the car that they had from the station to follow Howell the 3 blocks or so to the crash site. At the same time that Howell was recording the Cessna spiraling down to the ground, Hans Wendt snapped 2 photos of Flight 182, the first of which became the image which would be splashed alongside every story about the crash over the next few days. The other one would as well, but it's more of a silhouette because it's closer to the ground and not so high up to the sky against this bright, light blue, beautiful California morning sky. And so the second one is one that got published, but the other one is the one that you see them more often. Now, in that photo, Flight 182 is set against a clear blue sky and angling down toward the lower right corner of the picture. It tilts at an angle where both wings can be seen, but the closer one to the viewer, which is the right wing, is on fire. It trails smoke as it plummets. The leading edge of the wing, so the front edge, is clearly broken off in the middle. There's a clear length of it that is gone, impacting hydraulics, fuel lines, electricity, that sort of a thing. The nose section of the Cessna struck the ground at the intersection of 32nd and Polk in North Park, while the tail section dropped like a rock onto Ohio Street and Polk Avenue. Meanwhile, Pacific Southwest Flight 182 came down at the corner of Dwight and Niles Streets, a 5-minute drive or a 20-minute walk to the southeast of the Cessna's general crash area. It hit a mere 13 seconds after the collision with the Cessna, giving the flight crew almost no time to properly respond, even if the plane would have allowed them to. Given it was going at around 300 miles per hour when it plunged to the earth, the resulting damage to the plane, the passengers, and the neighborhood was catastrophic. The descriptions of the aftermath, as provided in the article This Is It, give the mental image of something out of a Final Destination sequel. 2 people driving in their Audi were crushed by falling debris. A daycare center located near the crash site lost one of its caregivers, as well as several of the kids attending that day. There was a 3-year-old who lost their life that day. A mom in a car with her baby understandably broke down when the body of a victim fell through the windshield of her car. Fortunately, both mom and baby were relatively okay. They had some scratches from glass, but they were fine. A woman who'd been talking on the phone with her sister while standing in the doorway of her home was crushed by falling debris, like mid-sentence. 144 people would lose their lives when Pacific Southwest Flight 182 and a small teaching plane collided over San Diego. The resulting crash of both vehicles killed everyone on both planes, 135 on PSA 182 and 2 in the Cessna, along with 7 people in the residential neighborhood, which wreckage rained down upon. At the time, this made it the deadliest air crash in the United States, and it remains the deadliest air accident in California history. 9 others on the ground were injured as a result of the debris which rained down on the neighborhood and the resulting fires, which at least partially, if not totally, destroyed 22 homes. First responders witnessed the scene as it happened, as it was only a few minutes before firefighters had arrived on the scene. A command post was quickly set up at a centrally located spot between the 2 crash sites at North Parkway and 32nd Street. 32nd Avenue, 32nd Street, I believe. A U.S. Navy fire engine also made it to the scene in minutes, which was a good thing as firefighters would need all the help they could get. Houses throughout the area of Dwight and Nile were engulfed in flames, and homeowners and neighbors were already attempting to help people who might be inside those homes to escape. A lot of people escaped out of their homes through back windows because the front of their house was on fire. Whatever they needed to do to get out of the house, that's what people were trying to help them do. A lot of people were, running over to help as soon as they could. Firefighters immediately found themselves facing a serious problem. The crash of the 727 broke a water main, making trying to get water from the hydrants like squeezing blood from a stone. Power lines and gas lines were also interrupted. Police and fire departments also needed to take precautions driving through the streets to reach the crash sites. The urge to drive there as fast as possible, that's the urge that you have as somebody who is a first responder in that situation. But the streets, along with the lawns, the roofs, the trees, were littered with bodies nobody wanted to run over. Bodies, body parts. There were a lot of body parts. However, firefighters came so quickly and in such large numbers that they were able to contain the fires by surrounding it. They successfully kept all of the fires contained to essentially one street. Basically, both sides of the street there were fires, but it was just there. Boeing used magnesium as part of the construction of that particular line of 727s, and the fires sparked by them couldn't be put out with water, so firefighters needed to be conscious of that. Meanwhile, locals tried to do what they could to help. They ran off to get water for firefighters to drink, given the heat that was going on that day. It was already a hot day as it was. Now they were going to be fighting fires, so they went to get them pitchers of water. They attempted to place blankets over the dead and any body parts that could be seen, which Battalion Chief Robert Osby, I think his first name was Robert, I think I wrote this without putting him in here, had to warn them against doing. There was no telling what combustible materials could be near or on the bodies, and they could get hurt. Police officers attended the wreck site to recover anything which could be used to identify the victims from the planes: licenses, personal effects, and of course, bodies. In the San Diego Magazine article, This Is It, police officer Gary Jouse described the human devastation left behind in visually graphic language. Quote, "There were no faces on the bodies. There were no bodies to speak of, only pieces. One alley was filled with just arms, legs, and feet. I worked at Claremont Mortuary before I became a cop, so I was able to do my duty without getting sick. I was no stranger to dead bodies, but I wasn't ready to see the torso of a stewardess slammed against a car." End quote. The bodies of the victims were brought to the gym at St. Augustine High School, where a makeshift morgue was quickly set up. Priests James Clifford and John Ronaldo moved from one body bag to another, administering last rites to remains which barely looked like people anymore. Later, coroners from San Diego and Los Angeles counties, several dentists, and the FBI's disaster squad went to work identifying each of the victims using fingerprints and dental records. Meanwhile, the pieces of Flight 182 and the Cessna were brought to an empty warehouse at Lindbergh Field. When Flight 182 struck the Cessna, its nose gear slammed into the smaller plane, which then tumbled back and hit that right wing. That hit knocked out that section of the leading edge of the 727's wing. The crash tore the Cessna in half, with Cassie stuck in the nose section and Boswell's remains still buckled into the severed tail section, which twirled down to the ground in the aforementioned video that was taken by Steve Howell. As part of the investigation, lead investigator Wally Funk and her team would need to interview anyone who witnessed the crash. And fortunately, there were several credible witnesses. There were a lot of people who saw it, but there were specifically people who gave better descriptions of what happened than others. Obviously, people like police and fire, they were giving better descriptions. She also said that she had a better time talking with kids because they told you what they saw rather than what they thought they saw. So she was getting a lot of information in regards to what people had witnessed that day. That included 4 firefighters from Engine Company 14 who were exercising on the northern part of Uppas Street, UPAS. I keep thinking of Uppies for some reason, near Balboa Park, just to the west of the site of the collision. Engineer John Allen heard a pop, turned, and saw the 2 planes careening towards the ground. The 727's right wing sported jagged pieces of the propeller of the Cessna, which had sliced through and severed hydraulics and fuel lines. It explained why a burst of flames spilled forth from that area of the plane in the famous photo taken as it went down. That was actually from the fuel from the Cessna that spilled out when it was basically crushed by that wing, torn apart. And so that gas tank on that plane spilled on the wing. Battalion Chief Robert Osby, I was right, it was Robert, had been standing outside Fire Station 28 speaking with several other firefighters about some training procedures coming up in the future. When one of the other firefighters drew Osby's attention to the planes, Osby turned just in time to see what he thought was one of the passenger jet's engines falling off and plummeting to the ground. According to him, quote, "I saw the smoking jet banking, turning towards the airport. It seemed to hang there for a second or two, then it continued its banking turn for another few seconds before it started spinning straight toward the ground." End quote. When investigators compared the 2 flight paths of the planes, they could see that Flight 182 was in the middle of its eastward path before it turned around to land, while the Cessna was headed northeast. Those 2 paths with those planes at those particular moments, with that particular moment, with the information that they had, should not have intersected, yet somehow the 2 planes collided. The tower should have noticed that, especially considering that particular control center had recently upgraded its radar to a system which would warn us such a thing. I said the tower, it was actually Miramar, which is the one that controls the larger area. But yeah, Miramar had recently gotten this new radar system that would alert you 40 seconds before there was to be a collision with two different pathways for these planes. The controller did get a warning. The controller at Miramar did get a warning alert on his radar. But after discussing the matter with his supervisor, he dismissed the warning. The problem was, well, you know how it is when you get a new toy. I just got a new phone. I switched from an iPhone to an Android. I get notifications for apps I don't remember putting on it. I'm sitting there trying to figure out how to make changes in settings and where to find stuff. Like, I'm so used to an iPhone that now I'm trying to figure out stuff with an Android again. And they come with solutions, new toys, but they also come with problems. In the case of the new radar system in the air traffic control office at Miramar, it gave potential collision warnings. 12 times a day, the radar was set off by two planes coming just close enough. And if you hear a warning enough, you start to dismiss it. You know, like when your smoke alarm beeps because it needs new batteries. Replace the batteries? Nah, let it beep. I'll replace the batteries when it gets really annoying. When it starts getting really close together, that's when I'll replace them. And as long as there's no fire, you tell yourself it's okay to dismiss it. That's just what controllers at Miramar had gotten used to since the new system was installed. What the controller did do was get in touch with the Cessna and remind them once again of the approaching 727. That was actually Miramar again. I said controller, I meant Miramar. But yeah, 727 actually, the Cessna, only had communications with Miramar. The 727 had communications with Miramar and Lindbergh. So the controller at Miramar got in touch with the Cessna after he got that alert to tell them, hey, just a reminder, you have a PSA flight, a passenger flight that is coming your way. Just keep an eye out. And he did not get a response. It was right about the time that he was getting in touch with them that the collision would have occurred. There were several reasons McFerrin and Fox could have mistaken or missed seeing the Cessna or lost track of the Cessna. For starters, the 727 was coming from a higher altitude than the Cessna was at. So the Cessna's flying even at like 3,000 feet or whatever it was at. And then you have the 727, which is coming down to land at Lindbergh Field. And so it's coming down relatively sharp even before it turns. And so it's, coming from above. That's why it hit the Cessna from above. It was entirely possible that from above and at landing speed, the crew simply couldn't see the Cessna because of the background of this quiet California suburb. It could have looked like a house or trailers or a couple of pickup trucks. Now, from above, it would have been white, and it would have looked like you would expect a Cessna to look like, but it would have been small, relatively small. So it may have been a problem where, they took their eyes off it for a second, and then they lost it. It happens. It happens to the best of us. Playing video games, real life, you're driving, whatever. You think you see something and you lose it. And that is something that could have happened here. There was also the possibility that there really was another Cessna in the area. And not every little plane has the transponder necessary for it to be seen on radar, and people in North Park had seen other smaller planes flying overhead that morning. The Cessna involved with the crash also wasn't where the PSA pilots described the plane they saw as being. They said it was at their 1 o'clock when the Cessna was at their 11 o'clock. It was also still in front of them when they said on the voice recorder that it had already passed them. There was, like I said, there was another Cessna there, according to the NTSB report, but it was a different type of Cessna. So it's entirely possible they may have seen that at, and then gotten confused at first, but then realized, no, that's not the Cessna we're supposed to be looking for. Like, it's entirely possible that there was more than one plane that confused them. Then there was the fact that landing requires going through a checklist and focusing on the task at hand. Takeoffs and landings need the crew to do more than they would during their time at altitude for the duration of the flight. With so much to go through, it's reasonable to imagine that they might have confused the Cessna and another flight due to being distracted by tasks related to the landing. It didn't help that Pacific Southwest had some heavy-duty scheduling that led to some crews commanding flights with little sleep or food or both. At the stopover in Los Angeles, Captain McFerrin remarked to a flight attendant, "It was a short night. I'm dragging." So at the very least, he may have been operating through fatigue, and he might have First Officer Fox, Flight Engineer Wayne. They were all flying with only 7 hours off between their last flight and this one. So it's entirely possible they did not get enough sleep. The NTSB did measurements within the interior of a similar cockpit to figure out when the pilots would have had the Cessna in view prior to the collision. Now, they get in there. I'm going to describe this for you. They get into this cockpit. They sit down in the seats. They just sit there. They don't move the seats or anything like that. So that's an important fact to keep in mind. They're sitting in their seats, not moving them like they're supposed to. According to their math, the Cessna would have been visible to both pilots for nearly 3 full minutes before the 727 hit the Cessna. They figured out exactly where it would have been at like 10 seconds before the crash, 20 seconds before the crash, 30 seconds before the crash, and they were able to go backwards and figure out that both of these pilots, the first officer and the captain, would have been able to see the Cessna if if they were seated as they were supposed to, if they're looking out the window. They should have been able to spot the Cessna. But that was before they took into consideration the fact that PSA pilots did what a lot of us do when we get into a vehicle that someone else has used. They adjusted their seats. They weren't supposed to, as the seats were set according to company guidelines, but they did. With their seats lowered, which they would do because they needed to be able to see all of their instruments, and the way that they were set, they really couldn't do that. So they would just kind of slide it back and make it go down. And that way they could see all of their instruments. But that changed the way that they looked out the window. With their seats lowered, the Cessna was in a spot where both of them would have only been able to see it for about 5 seconds. Not to mention, as they're going in for this landing, their nose up. And so that's tilting the nose even more up. That is something that made it so that they only had this 5-second interval when they would have been able to see this plane that they were supposed to be keeping an eye on. Captain McFerrin communicated with the tower that they had them a minute ago when they were first told to be aware of the Cessna. But this is where communication between the tower and Flight 182 becomes muddled, and it's clear that they think they're understanding each other when they're not. When McFerrin said, "We had them a minute ago," the tower understood that to mean that the crew could see the Cessna, which was not accurate. It was more like, "We had them a minute ago," instead of, "Oh, we had them a minute ago." Like, we just, we locked onto them. We know where they are. We've had them in sight for a little bit. Instead of, "We just spotted them and now we can't see them anymore." McFerrin said to the tower, "I think he's passed off to our right." Instead of hearing "passed" over the radio, however, the controller at Lindbergh Field heard "passing." The NTSB report, I believe, kind of theorizes that either there was some static or the controller at Lindbergh Field thought he heard "passing." The air crash investigation episode said that it was due to radio static. But the important thing is that on the other end of the radio, you have someone who thinks he heard the word "passing" instead of "passed." There is a difference between the two words at a time like this. If you're driving a car and someone has passed you, they are either behind you or they are in front of you. If they're passing you, they're on your left or on your right. The difference when you're talking about a situation like Flight 182 and the Cessna is that if the Cessna was passing, they could still see it, or they should be able to still see it. If it had already passed them, it was entirely possible they couldn't see it anymore. You have a captain and a controller having a conversation regarding locations in which both people have a different understanding of where those vehicles are located, and that puts both of them at a serious and dangerous disadvantage. I think of the game Telephone. This is not that, obviously, but you start off telling somebody one thing, and they whisper it to somebody else, and they whisper it to somebody else, and they whisper it to somebody else. By the time it gets to that person at the end, they have no idea what was said, or it's completely mangled. This is not exactly the same thing, but that radio becomes the person in the middle, or the group of people in the middle. And anybody who's ever listened to any sort of cockpit voice recording knows that there is a lot of noise on those radios. They are not the best. They don't sound great. I don't know if they have improved since 1978 or how much they have improved, but I do know that the audio for this particular crash and for similar crashes, like it there's obstructions in the background. Basically, you're hearing the sounds of this huge plane moving through the air, of the electronics and everything, all of the engines and everything that's going on. You're hearing all of that along with the voices. And so there is a lot of noise on these recordings. And the communications between one plane and another, the controller, another, like, there is a lot going on. So the fact that the controller at Lindbergh Field and Captain McFerrin, that there's a misunderstanding there, it's not surprising, but it should be something where the two of them kind of realized, hey, there might be some confusion about what we're saying to one another, or if my understanding is correct. The pilots did not properly describe their understanding or lack thereof of where the Cessna was or might be. They were still confused, but the tower controller did not understand that because they weren't being clear about their confusion. They could have easily said something along the lines of, "Tower, we cannot locate the Cessna. Could you please provide more information on its location, or should we go around and try again?" But unfortunately, they did not. If they had told the tower controller could have said, "Okay, well, I'll put you in a holding pattern or something along those lines, and I'll see if I can, like, navigate you away from that, or, we circulate around again, whatever we need to do to make sure that you can land if you cannot see this plane and identify where it is." That said, Boswell and Casey were also found to share in the blame. At a point in their flight just before the collision, they made a little bit of a change in the 70-degree heading they were flying. They actually turned to like 90 degrees. So a little bit is, I think a little bit is not exactly the right term. But yeah, they went from 70 degrees to 90 degrees. Maybe they thought the tower didn't need to be informed of something that minor. Clearly, they did need to be informed, but because the two people in the Cessna didn't share that information with the tower, the controller couldn't share it with Flight 182. It didn't help that Flight 182 was in touch with Miramar and Lindbergh Field, but the Cessna could only contact Miramar. If they'd been able to hear Flight 182's communications, they would have known the other plane had lost sight of them and had been able to respond accordingly. I think I said before that Cessna was talking to the field, the tower controller, but they were not. They were talking to Miramar. That was the only one they could talk to. So they couldn't overhear what PSA 182 was saying or anything like that. They weren't on the same channel, anything like that. And so you have these three different people, these two different groups of people, four groups of people, because you're talking about Miramar and Lindbergh Field, who are trying to understand or think they understand that they're getting the information through to one another, and they're not. The collision between Flight 182 and the Cessna was one of several aircraft accidents which led to the invention of TCAS, Traffic Collision Avoidance Systems. TCAS is now installed in aircraft throughout the industry, warning planes that they are on a collision course with another aircraft sharing the same sky. So basically the same thing that the Miramar controller was seeing on his controls, that same alert, that's what you get with TCAS. And it also will tell you, will tell one plane to pull up and another one to go down so that this way they can avoid one another. Now, they're supposed to listen to that. There is another collision that happened over Germany, which one of these days I don't know if I covered it or not. I think I did not cover that one yet. But that particular collision happened after TCAS was installed in all of these different planes. And these two planes were told different things. One was told to go up, the other was told to go down. And the controller, who was saddled with 15 different distractions, informed the plane that was being told to go up, to go down. They listened to the controller, and the two planes collided. Another change was to Lindbergh Field, where visual separation was abandoned in favor of a terminal radar service area. After the collision, Lindbergh Field would have controllers lead landings and departures using radar rather than leaving it to aircraft crews to be the main ones responsible for keeping separate from other planes. The tower controller would control planes below a certain height, and the Miramar controller, or where Miramar was, that particular approach control group, they control higher than that. And so Lindbergh is kind of Lindbergh Field, their controller would be focusing on, tracking this plane and not leaving that up to crews who could lose track of a plane and accidentally hit one. Pacific Southwest would end up paying out $5.5 million, or about $28 million today, to people who filed wrongful death lawsuits against them or sued because of the destruction of their homes. At Lindbergh Field, employees hung a plaque to remember their coworkers who died aboard Flight 182. However, it was taken down several years later when PSA was bought out by US Air, with former PSA public relations staffer Marjorie Craig saying, "I think it's in someone's garage, and that's a shame. It would not stay gone forever." Inside the San Diego Air and Space Museum, there stands a red and white kiosk that is a replica of the original Pacific Southwest reservations desk at Lindbergh Field in 1949, which had once been a U.S. Marine Corps latrine. On the outside are several plaques. One of them is the memorial plaque, which formerly hung at PSA headquarters until its buyout, successfully recovered from whoever had it hanging in their garage. If you go to the intersection of Dwight and Nile today and stand on the southeast corner of the intersection, you would find that a bronze plaque identical to the one hanging on the kiosk at the Air and Space Museum is set into the sidewalk. It lists the date of the crash as well as all of the victims, the passengers of Flight 182, the 2 on the Cessna, and the 7 on the ground in San Diego. It is a simple but powerful reminder of one of the darkest days in San Diego's history. It's still the deadliest plane crash in California history. And watching the film or the video, whatever was recorded that day from the news of what happened there, it's terrifying and it's upsetting. And you keep expecting to see some of the horrible things that are described by all of these people who were there that day. First responders, police, fire department, people who were like EMTs and things like that. And then you have, who are coming to help the people who had been injured. And then you've got people who lived in the neighborhood and were trying whatever they could do to help. And they're seeing all of this. And on one hand, you have officers like Gary Jouse, who had worked in an area where they saw a lot of bodies before, and so they were not used to this sort of thing, but at least had some experience with seeing bodies. And even for him, the way that he describes it is very traumatizing. The way that a lot of people who saw these images describe it, saw it in real life, the way the people describe it, it sounds a lot like PTSD, the things that they experienced and the things that they had to work through. And I'm sure that for people who lived in the area, I'm not sure if they would have been able or been suggested to get the sort of therapy that you would be suggested to get today if you experience this sort of thing where you just have 2 planes and a bunch of bodies falling on your neighborhood. But the descriptions of what happened with the passengers and the crew and the people in the Cessna and the people on the ground, it's terrifying and it's really upsetting. And decades later, people were still haunted by the things that they saw there. Officers and other witnesses who were interviewed in some of these sources, in This Is It and in the one that is on the San Diego History.org site, those 2 sources did get some interviews with people who had been there back then, and they said how they had all of these, horrible, terrible things that they had seen, and sometimes they couldn't go back to the site. Sometimes they did and just kind of walked around and are kind of amazed. Because right now, if you look at that particular area on Google Maps or Apple Maps or whatever, it is on Street View. It's a normal neighborhood. It's, single story houses and it's the kind of place that it looks really nice that you would like to live there. And to have two planes fall out of the sky onto your neighborhood when it looks that serene, that, nice, normal, very, just, I was going to say Spielberg, but no, Spielberg in the 80s. And no, probably not the best comparison there, because how many normal neighborhoods got invaded by aliens in Spielberg movies? Anyway, back in the day, at least. Anyway, or now, I guess. That was the last movie he put out, right? I can't even remember what it was. Oh, I haven't gone to the movies in ages. Anyway, yeah, it's just horrifying to imagine that sort of thing happening where you live. I had so many nightmares in my last apartment because I'd been there for so long. And there's not really a lot of things in regards to like terrible things that happen that could have happened to the house where I was living in, to the building that I was living in. And, sometimes I would just have these terrible intrusive thoughts of like a plane crashing and falling on my house. Maybe I saw Donnie Darko way too many times, which, I saw it like 4 or 5 times. I haven't seen it a lot of times. I've seen it like a couple of times, maybe. And it's just the image of that, the engine falling through the ceiling, that sort of a thing. I think that played in my head the whole time. I've seen and watched so many episodes of Air Crash Investigation and seen so many like TV shows and news stories and things like that where planes crash in neighborhoods. And I think that's always kind of something that dwells in the back of my head, because when I lived in that previous apartment, I really didn't know. I couldn't tell you one way or another if there were planes flying overhead close enough or under a flight path or whatever to where I was that a plane would crash in my house. I mean, even if it was a small plane, if you've ever seen The World According to Garp, the movie, there's a scene where Robin Williams plays Garp, and he and his wife are looking for a house, and they're with the realtor at this really nice house. And while they're standing there, a little plane, a little like Cessna, like single engine plane, comes out of the sky and crashes into the side of the house. And Garp goes, "We'll take it." And they're like, the wife and the realtor are like, "Seriously?" And he's like, "Yeah, when is a plane ever going to crash into this house again? We beat the odds. We did it. This is out of the way. We don't have to worry about this sort of thing happening again." So I think, yeah, things like that have stuck in my head. And I think now it's different that I'm in my new apartment, because my new apartment is unfortunately across the street from a river. So it's not one that normally swells or floods or anything like that. But that gets to be my new fear, that I'm going to be asleep in my bed one day and I'm just going to, wake up in the morning and my bed is going to be like under 3 feet of water. I don't know. Anyway, yeah, that's the fear that I had, watching the Air Crash Investigation episode on this and watching video of that day, the news footage and everything. It's just something that terrified me back in my old apartment. And now I'm not too worried about that. Although that can happen anywhere, I'm sure. Just some plane going the wrong way or something along those lines. I'm just making it worse, aren't I? For myself and possibly for you guys. So I have been very well behaved, and I have gotten out another episode on time. Go me. So hopefully I'll be able to do that again next week. Fingers crossed. Let's everybody cross our fingers, especially considering my brother and his fiance are getting married this weekend. So congratulations to them. Preemptively, congratulations to them. They're just getting married at the courthouse. It's nothing big or anything. Not the courthouse. The mayor of our hometown is marrying them. So yeah, this is cool. This is good. Hopefully I will be able to, take care of that and then take care of next episode before the end of the month. get that out of the way. Let's keep this. This is a good track record. I'm doing very well. Kudos to me. And to everybody who is listening, thank you so much. And until next time, stay safe.